Good evening, everyone. I'm Judy De Winter. I'm a Royal Free London elected patient governor and the lead governor. And on behalf of the Council of Governors, I'd like to warmly welcome you all here this evening to the Trust's annual members meeting and AGM. We've got a number of different stakeholders joining us for this meeting, including members of our Council of Governors, members of the Trust leadership team and our non-exec directors, as well as key stakeholder representatives, including Health Watch, our local councillors, representatives from our charity, and of course our members. So welcome to you all. Like everything at the moment, we're having to do things differently, and this is a new way of delivering this particular event. So I'd like to point out a few areas of housekeeping. This event is being recorded so that those who haven't been able to join us can watch and listen after the event. I'm pleased to say that almost 550 individuals registered for this event, and therefore for tonight's meeting, you're all set up to participate in a way that's appropriate for the number of attendees. So for example, your cameras have been disabled and you've automatically been put on mute. However, the chat function is enabled and you're going to hear more about how that's going to work later on. This meeting is going to be minuted, and I'd like to note the draft minutes of the last AGM from 2019, and those minutes are on the Trust website. So we're now going to move on to the formal part of the meeting, and my role tonight is to present for a few minutes on behalf of the Council of Governors on some of our activities that we've undertaken on your behalf over the past financial year. As many of you are aware, the Council of Governors represents you, our members, Trust staff and the public. So our annual members meeting is a really important opportunity to report back to you. The Council of Governors, otherwise known as the Council, represents your interests and your views, and we're the mechanism by which the Trust is accountable to you. The Council comprises approximately 28 elected and appointed governors and is made up of different stakeholders from different constituencies such as staff, patients, the public, local councillors, CCGs and UCL. And we work collectively and come together to make decisions, make recommendations and to challenge the Trust Board on its performance. The Council recently welcomed Charlotte Benjamin as an appointed governor representing our North Central London clinical commissioning groups, and 3 governors stepped down: Stephen Cameron, who served on the Council of Governors for 8 years, Christine Hamilton and Ian Bretman, and I'd like to thank them all for their contributions. As I'm sure you know, the Council of Governors will have 12 vacancies that will be filled in the upcoming election, and I would urge you as our members to vote in the election. The last day for voting is the 24th of September, and our newly elected governors will be announced shortly after that date. We're also very sorry to see a number of our long-standing governors leave the Council in September, as they'll be at the end of their terms. So I'd like to thank those governors and all governors stepping down on behalf of the Council for their time and commitment to the role. And we look forward to welcoming our newly elected governors who'll be joining us at the end of the month following the election. Something that I report on every year at our AGM is the average age of the Council, which currently stands at 58. BAME representation on the Council is 25%, with 67% of our governors who are male and 33% female. During the latter part of the last financial year, some of our activities were limited for obvious reasons due to COVID, but we continued to carry out our statutory duties by meeting online. However, for much of the past year, the Council has been busy and fully engaged. As well as carrying out those statutory duties, there are a number of other areas that we've been focusing on. Last year, I talked about the Council setting up the local councils members meetings, local members councils, which meet regularly. And we recognise that as a group of hospitals, we need to factor in local stakeholder needs and promote engagement with the local communities. So there's one local members council for each of our 3 hospital sites, each chaired by a non-exec director, and they're populated with governors and other stakeholders with a plan to broaden out the membership. Our Medicine for Members events have been very popular, and some of you would have attended our recent Medicine for Members event, which was our first one online, where our presenters talked about how the Royal Free London is providing care to its patients as we learn to live with COVID. This event was really well attended, with over 150 members joining online. Other Medicine for Members events that took place throughout the year covered topics such as cardiology at the Royal Free and frailty, living well and dying well, which was held at Barnet Hospital. We've continued to ensure that the patient voice comes through at these events, inviting a patient or a carer to contribute, as we've learned that that's what our members really want to hear about, the benefit of our work to patients. If you didn't manage to get to any of those events, they're filmed and they're up on the Trust website, so you can take a look. A key part of our role as governors is to hold the non-exec directors to account for the performance of the board, and this is something that we take really seriously. As governors, we sit on board committees, and this gives us the opportunity to observe the non-exec directors carrying out their role of holding the executive to account for the performance of the trust. We also, as governors, sit on a number of other committees and working groups, particularly around some of the larger trust projects, and also on working groups that focus on equality and diversity and bullying and harassment. When we were able to, pre-COVID, we accompanied non-exec directors to go-see visits, where we visit areas of the trust and we meet the teams and we meet patients. The Nominations Committee, which is a committee of the Council of Governors and chaired by the Trust Chair, Dominic Dodd, has an important role. For example, it has delegated authority from the Council to oversee the process for Chair and non-exec director performance appraisals, which take place annually, and also to oversee the process of appointment and reappointment of non-exec directors on the board. Over the last year, following recommendations from the Nominations Committee, the Council supported the appointment of Professor David Lomas to be the appointed non-exec director for UCL, replacing Tony Shapira, who's stepping down from the board after 9 years of service and who has contributed greatly to the Trust Board and to the Trust. The Council of Governors also reappointed 2 of our non-exec directors, Hector Raja and Mary Basterfield, for a second term. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all of our non-exec directors for their time and commitment, particularly over the past year. Membership-wise, I'm pleased to say that our membership numbers have increased since our last annual members meeting by 3,800 members, which is an increase of 13%, taking us to well over 33,000 members. Unsurprisingly, we saw a large increase in membership during the peak of the COVID crisis, when our communities were particularly interested and engaged with what was going on in their local hospitals. And finally, I'd like to thank Carolyn Cullen, our Trust Secretary, and Matt Curl, our Membership and Governance Manager, for supporting the Council of Governors and our membership, much of the time behind the scenes. And I'd also like to thank those of you who have contacted the governors by email. It's a really good way to get across your concerns, your input and your suggestions. We respond quickly and we really like to hear from you. Our email address will be shown on the screen at the end of the event. Usually we'd hope to meet you before and after this event, but of course that's not possible this evening. As soon as we're able to meet in person, we hope to see you, but until then, we'll continue with our programme of work remotely. So I'm now going to thank you for listening and hand over to the Trust Chair, Dominic Dodd.
Thank you, Judy, and good evening, everyone. As Judy said, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Dominic Dodd and I'm the Chair of the Royal Free London. Usually at our annual members meetings, we take a look back at the year, in this case, the year to April 2020. And there is much to look back at. For instance, we celebrated our 2000th liver transplant at the Royal Free Hospital. At Barnet Hospital, our clinicians started using our pioneering Streams app, which helps us to be alerted to deteriorating kidney function very quickly. And Chase Farm Hospital was recognised nationally as one of the most advanced digitally in the NHS. And we also opened the country's largest decontamination unit in Enfield, which is capable of sterilising 20 million instruments a year. All of that's covered as a review of the year, along with our financial accounts and our quality accounts in our annual report. And I would really encourage you to find it on the website. It's not that hard to find, and to download it. We are trying to be, as ever, as candid and transparent about our shortcomings as we are clear about our achievements. So hopefully it's frank and informative. But this is not a usual year. In March, all of our lives changed dramatically. For our part at the Royal Free London, we have seen since March, we've seen 4,211 patients with COVID. The vast majority of those we were able to successfully treat and discharge. But since March, we have lost 475 patients to COVID. And our heartfelt condolences go out to the family and friends of each and every one of those who died. I want to personally thank our 10,000 staff for the expertise, energy and devotion to patients that they've shown over this period. I was really struck in talking to different staff members in different functions at different hospitals as to how many of them responded to my question of how they were and how they were feeling by saying the same thing. And that was, this is what we do. And I had the privilege of being inside attending the Gold Command meetings, which were held daily, where our senior clinicians and our executive leadership were making decisions every day about managing through this public health emergency. And I remember thinking to myself, I wished more people could see the calm, the skill, and the compassion of our leadership team. And I thank you all for everything that you have done. I want to thank our governors. Many of our staff governors worked on the clinical front line, including in intensive care. Several public and patient governors were former clinicians who volunteered to return and help. Many governors organised donations and help and support for our staff. Thank you all. The Royal Free Charity and volunteers have been truly incredible and were very much joined at the hip with us, working alongside us to support staff. And Judy, in your other role as chair of the charity, I just wanted to personally thank you and the team at the charity for everything that you've done. Our local communities, businesses, faith groups have sent us literally hundreds of thousands of donations of essential items and showed their solidarity in many ways, both big and small. But in particular tonight, I actually want to thank our patients. We were able to cope with the wave 1 of COVID because of the sacrifices that everyone made in lockdown, particularly those shielding. And also because we stood down many of our usual activities, and I know that that has made life very difficult for very many of our patients. And so in this rather unusual year, we'd like to do something different tonight. We want not to look back, but to look forward. We want to address the pressing questions that I know the public and our communities have right now about the months to come. Questions like, how are we facing the challenge of winter? What are we doing in order to see all those patients who have waited and have waited far too long for care? What are we doing to look after our staff as this turns into a marathon and not a sprint? And our Group Chief Executive, Caroline Clark, is going to be talking to those questions. I'm very pleased that we have Dr. Sanjay Bagani, one of our consultants in infectious diseases, here with us to address the question of what have we learned and what are we learning about how to help and treat those who catch COVID and need hospital care. And there's the question of what are we doing to keep our patients safe so that they can feel confident in coming back and using our services, and what are we doing to keep our staff safe as we go forward. And our new Group Chief Nurse, Julie Hamilton, is here to talk to us about that. The risk of these virtual meetings, as I'm sure a lot of you who attend them know, is being talked at for long periods of time and being subjected to trial by PowerPoint presentations. So we're going to try to do things differently on that front as well. Firstly, our speakers will be keeping their talks short, within 10 minutes, and we've banned slides. We've given special dispensation from this rule to Peter Ridley, who's our Chief Financial Officer, who's been allowed a few slides with which to conduct our formal business of receiving the annual financial accounts, which we'll be coming to later on. But most importantly, we'll be trying to make this interactive and as interactive as we can by taking and answering your questions. We have some of those that have been submitted in advance. Thank you for those who did that. And we're now opening the Q&A function for you to use. So please look for the question mark or Q&A symbol, which is usually on the top right-hand side of your screen. And please submit your questions at any time. I'll be asking some of those at the end of each speaker's talk, but we've reserved a good slice of time to go through the rest of the questions in a Q&A at the end. I can't promise that we're going to get through all of them, but I can commit that we will answer all of them and post answers to those we don't get to on our website after tonight. And as ever, if your question is specific to your own care, we would really ask you to contact our Patient Advice and Liaison Service, who can help you directly. So with that, thank you for your incredible support. Thank you for being here tonight. And I'm going to pass over now to our Group Chief Executive, Caroline Clark.
Thank you, Dominic, and thank you for the introduction. As Dominic said, this is supposed to be a review of last year, 1920, and what we did that year. But of course, our world's changed in March, in fact, in February. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the end of the year and then about the challenges that Dominic described and what we're doing to make sure that we provide great care for all our patients as quickly as we can. So here's our brief story. We saw our first patient on February the 9th. We stepped up our efforts through early March before the English lockdown, which actually was on March the 23rd. So the Royal Free, as a group of hospitals, were thinking about this a long time before England went into lockdown. Some other dates that might resonate with people listening. The Nightingale opened its doors on April the 3rd. On April the 4th, we expanded our intensive care units on the Royal Free site and the Barnet site. If you remember, Easter was just about the end of the first week in April. Our busiest day for seeing patients with the COVID virus was April the 7th, when we had 415 patients at the Royal Free and 274 at Barnet. Our hospitals were very, very busy, and Easter was cancelled for our staff. Throughout that time, we tried to make it as easy as possible for our staff to come to work. We provided free food, free parking, access to psychological support, a pop-up supermarket, community boxes for our staff to access food. And we tried to remove all those irritants of the working day to make it easy for our staff to come to work and care for our patients. In numbers, we provided over 350,000 meals to our staff, and we received over 250,000 donations of essential items. Our charity was instrumental in all that. So I want to, of course, say a massive thank you to them and to the very, very kind members of our local community, some who may be listening to this, who donated money, food and other goods to keep us going. We are genuinely humbled and very grateful for your support. Thank you. All that support enabled us to reorganise ourselves and to adopt new models of clinical care as our patient numbers rose. And our clinical and support staff stepped up to the plate. Many people, in fact, switched roles completely. Some of our staff didn't see their loved ones for a very long time. Our trainee doctors stepped up to the plate. They were amazing. Most people had families who worried about them as they joined other workers on their commute to work each day. And that is why, as a nation, of course, we clapped. Now, as we gather our strength and prepare for the next increase in COVID cases and autumn sets in, we face a number of challenges, and Dominic alluded to these. So I'm going to focus on 4. I'm going to talk about getting ready for winter. I'm going to talk about how we make access to our services better, particularly for people who've been waiting a long time. I'm going to talk about how we do some of that differently and virtually, as we are tonight. And finally, I'm going to talk about how we make sure our amazing staff can get ready for a difficult winter. So Julie, our chief nurse, will talk about some of the safety aspects of getting ready for winter, but I just want to describe what will be different. If you walk into our hospitals now, they look and feel quite different. Everyone's wearing masks, we have one-way systems, we have safety screens in some places, and we have a lot of additional capacity. On the Royal Free site, we're expanding our intensive care capacity to cover 3 floors, and if we need it, we have up to 100 ITU beds. At Barnet, we've built a new ward, the Rainbow Ward, which will open shortly, which gives us 35 extra beds. We massively increased the oxygen capacity on the Royal Free site, and we have big stocks of protective gear for all our staff now. And on that note, I'd like to thank all the people who volunteered at the Hampstead Gown Factory, who made something like 40,000 protective theatre gowns, which adds to our stock and make us more resilient for the winter. We're working across North London with all our partners in the health and local authority systems to make sure that we help each other through the winter. These partnerships were invaluable through the last few months, and we've built some really good relationships. We're making sure that our services can stay open as much as possible through the winter, and we're having to make some temporary moves. That includes moving some surgical services between providers, and there are some temporary changes to services like paediatrics. I must stress these are temporary, and we won't do anything permanent until we're clearer about what the world looks like post-pandemic. Finally, on winter, I can't talk about winter without plugging the flu vaccine. Shortly, you'll hear about the seasonal flu campaign nationally, and you'll be able to get your flu jab via a number of routes. Our campaign to immunise our staff begins in October, and it's a vital part of making sure that we're prepared for winter. So that was the first challenge. Second challenge want to talk about how how people access our services, and specifically about waiting times. Over the last 20 years, the NHS has moved from having an average waiting time for a procedure of 18 months to 18 weeks, and that was a real achievement. But over the last few years, that had proved more challenging. Pre-COVID, in January, 1 in 6 patients was waiting more than 18 weeks. Nationally, that's over 700,000 people. To clear that number, even before COVID, would have required an awful lot of extra capacity. And of course, now, given that we had a pause in planned care that we were providing, we need to do even more. The Royal Free Group is one of the biggest surgical providers in the NHS, and consequently, we have a lot of patients waiting for treatment, and some of those patients have been waiting for a long time. So what are we doing about that? Well, of course, we're ramping up our capacity every day in every specialty. We're trying to get back to at least the amount of work we were doing before COVID. Of course, how we do that is important, though. Our teams are getting used to new ways of working, they're wearing new kit, and patients coming into our hospitals are having to observe different pre-hospital infection control routines, and we're doing some operations in different places. Many clinics are being held over the phone or via video, and that leads me to the third thing that I want to talk about. So our third challenge now is really, how do we deliver care differently? Not everyone can have their care over the phone or via a camera, but lots of people can, and they like it. So we need to make sure that that choice is available and that our digital infrastructure allows us to do that. Chase Farm, as Dominic has said, is as modern as it can be, and last year it received the highest international accolade for what we do there. And over the next 2 years, we are committed to making sure that Barnet and the Royal Free site have exactly that same infrastructure. The infrastructure is important because it allows us to do things like this, hold meetings virtually, but it also allows us to do the work on our making sure that we provide the best care for patients in the best possible way, with as little unwarranted variation as possible. And it makes it much easier for our clinicians to practice really great medicine and provide the best possible care. Recently, we've also launched what we call a patient portal, My RFL Care, which allows patients to access their notes, schedule appointments, and ultimately will allow patients to have much more control over what happens to them. So far in the first month, over 15,000 people have registered for this, and we think that in time it will be a really, really big component of how some people access care. So that's the third challenge. Final thing I want to talk about is, of course, our amazing staff. I talked earlier about some of the work that our staff are engaged in, and of course you may have been one of the 3 million people who watched the BBC Two documentary Hospital, where you'll have seen for yourself the intensity and the complex nature of what we do and how hard our staff work. We did everything, as I said, that we could to take the pebbles out of the shoes of our staff during April and May, but as Peter will remind us later, NHS cash is constrained. We aren't financed to do a lot of what we'd like to do, and we relied on the generous contributions of the public and our charity to help. We've realised in order to provide great care that we need to do more, and we've realised that taking care of our staff is super important. Like many people, we were saddened by the differential impact of the COVID-19 on our BAME communities, where mortality was much higher. It led us to think about how we make sure that our staff are protected, how we make sure that staff are assessed so that we our staff can work in the right parts of the hospital, and we look after them. And we're working with all our staff networks to make sure that we get this right. We're also working shoulder to shoulder with our charity on a comprehensive wellbeing programme for all our staff, and figuring out more creative ways to help keep our staff happy and well through whatever happens to us next. Before I conclude, I'd just like to say this is our annual members meeting. I can't be here without paying tribute to our governors. Our council have been supporters, they've been critical friends, they've been ambassadors throughout. I cannot thank you enough for the time and the care that you have given us all. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Caroline. I wonder if I could ask you a few questions that we've had coming in. The first one was, were COVID patients treated across all of our trust sites?
So we, during March, we stood down a lot of our planned care, much of which takes place at Chase Farm. So in fact, virtually all our care took place on the Royal Free and Barnet sites, and limited services on the other sites. And that also applies that some services on Edgware and Finchley, but more limited.
Thanks. And next question was, could you speak a little about how the Trust has used and is using the money raised by the Royal Free charity?
Yeah, of course. So so the charity, so a couple of things. So I talked about the taking the pebbles out of the shoes for our colleagues. So the main things that we've spent it on so far are food. So we fed people, because actually, it turns out that particularly at those beginning days of lockdown, it was really hard for our staff to go shopping or spend time. So actually, for 2 months, we provided an awful lot of free meals and a supermarket, and so 350,000 free meals. We provided levels of psychological support in a number of different programs for our staff, so that they had different places to go and talk about what they were experiencing. And we're now working with the charity on kind of what next, and actually asking our staff what they want more of next, to make sure that we have something that goes on into the future.
Okay, thank you. And I'm going to ask one more question. There are more, but we'll come to them later on. The Pears building was due to complete in autumn of this year. Is that still on track? And a related question is, will it have cafes or restaurants?
Yeah, so the Pears building, you'll understand there was some delay, but actually it was limited. It was less of a delay than I thought there would be. It will open next year, and at the moment it will have a cafe. I don't think it's going to have a restaurant, but I think we need to, like all our buildings, take stock of what the world looks like post-pandemic, or when the COVID virus is endemic, and figure out what we're able to do. But at the moment, it's planned to have a cafe.
Thanks very much, Caroline. As I said, there are more questions for you, but we'll get to those later on. I'd like to move on now to Sanjay Bagani, one of our infectious diseases consultants, who will be talking about what we've learned about how to treat COVID patients. Over to you, Sanjay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the Council of Governors, executive team, our dear stakeholders, and ladies and gentlemen. So I'm Sanjay Bagani. I'm an infectious diseases consultant here at the Royal Free Hospital, based at the Hampstead site. As many of you will be aware, at the Royal Free in Hampstead, we are a high consequence infectious diseases center, so one of 2 national centers that can look after patients with person-to-person transmissible infections and dangerous infections. And so we have the capacity, capability, and expertise to do that. And it's not surprising that, when we started to hear about reports of this new pneumonia coming through from China in December, we were alerted to the fact that there might be something in the offing. Between Christmas and New Year 1919, 1920, we heard that this was a coronavirus infection, and we were ready to think about how this was going to play out on a global scale. It won't come as a surprise to any of you that we saw our first case on the 9th of February 2020, as the virus started to spread outside of Wuhan in China, across China into Europe. We had people going away on skiing holidays, coming back to the UK. And so we saw our first cases through February who were reasonably well and manageable. By March, things had taken a completely different turn, as you all well know, and we were into the pandemic. We were seeing an upsurge, a real upsurge of cases, and the hospital really moved into the sort of pandemic setting. So at this stage, all our medical teams came together to concentrate on looking after patients with COVID-19. And that the rest is, as they say, is history, but the whole hospital became a COVID hospital with expanded intensive care, expanded capacity within the ED departments, etc. At this stage in the infectious diseases department, we did what we do best, which is to think about what can we learn about this virus very quickly? What can we learn about the clinical infection very quickly? And how can we best manage this infection in terms of treatment? So we got involved in a number of international clinical studies to look at the natural history of the infection, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But we also then got involved in a number of clinical trials, and I'll come back to those in a second. So just to put things into context for everybody, over the course of March to June, we looked after over 1,000 patients at the Royal Free site, with over 100 patients on our intensive care unit. And as Caroline Clark had put it, we did lose patients, and so we saw that 1 in 6 of the people that we admitted died, and that this was probably slightly higher on the intensive care unit. So this virus wasn't as benign as we'd originally thought when reports started to come out of China in December. I suppose the first thing that we learned about the natural history of the virus is that there are 3 phases of the infection. So there is that first phase of infection, which is the viral replication phase, which is almost like an influenza type illness, except that this has a couple of peculiarities. One is a loss of sense of smell, and the other is the loss of sense of taste. But the vast majority of people get through that first phase, which lasts about 6 or 7 days, and recover. We learned that a small minority of patients actually go on to the next phase of illness, where the virus travels down to the lungs, causes inflammation in the lungs. And then there is a smaller percentage of those that move on to the next phase of illness, which is the inflammatory phase of illness, where not only do you get inflammation in the lungs, but you get inflammation in the kidneys, in the heart, in the blood vessels. And so these are patients that require intensive care support with mechanical ventilation, often with renal support. They have inflammation of the heart, and they're at risk of clots in the lungs. And so these were the things that we learned quite early on in terms of the natural history of the infection. But what was important for us was to try and work out what predisposed people to these risks. And we learned very quickly that the older you were, the more likely you were to have progressive infection. If you had certain comorbidities, particularly if you were overweight, or you had diabetes, or blood pressure, or heart problems, you were more likely to progress. And then, as has been mentioned already, if you are of BAME, ethnic origin, then there was an increased risk. The next thing that we were really keen to do was to try and work out what was the best supportive care for our patients. In other words, how could we support them through the illness best, and what treatments could we offer them? In terms of supportive care, we learned very quickly that you had to get your fluid balance right. If you gave people too much fluid, they got wet lungs and they couldn't oxygenate properly. If you give them too little fluid, the kidneys shut down. So we tried to get that right. We also learned on our intensive care unit that if you put people in the prone position, in other words, face down, you could get oxygenation better. And so this helped improve oxygenation to people's blood and help save lives. But most importantly, we were thinking about treatments. As you're all aware, there were many treatments that were banded around as being effective for COVID-19 as we started the pandemic, some of which were proclaimed by world leaders as being the right thing to do. We were very aware that the best way to assess treatments was through clinical trials, and with the support of our clinical research network and our R&D team, we set up clinical trials very, very quickly. And at the end of that first phase, we've learned that some treatments work, and so we've learned that remdesivir, which is an intravenous antiviral agent, which was originally developed for Ebola virus, has a positive effect on COVID-19 and in fact is now licensed for COVID-19. We also learned that when people get very, very inflammatory, in other words, getting the need to go to the intensive care unit requiring mechanical ventilation and organ support, then low-dose steroids or dexamethasone through the recovery trial actually works. And so, as we move to the next phase, and I'm afraid it is inevitable that we're going to see an upsurge of infections in the next few weeks to few months, we have a better handle on how we offer best supportive care to our patients and specific treatments, particularly remdesivir and low-dose steroids. But the quest isn't quite over yet. We haven't quite got the panacea of treatment, and we need to do more research and more studies. The one thing that we've learned is, whilst we can predict who's likely to get to the second and third stage of infection, what would be ideal is to try and offer people treatment at that stage to stop them progressing on to the next few phases. And in that regard, we're about to start off some clinical trials for people presenting to the emergency department with early COVID-19, where we're going to try and see if we can give them antiviral therapy so that we can stop progression of disease. We're also working very hard on vaccines, and there are a number of new antivirals and monoclonal antibodies that are going to be coming through. So I'm going to stop there, but before I do, I'd like to thank all of our clinical teams who all came together in a fluid motion to try and tackle this big problem that we had. But not only was it just the clinical teams, but it was everybody else in the hospital that supported all of us to bring this together. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you so much, Sanjay, and we'd all echo those thanks to every team across the Trust. I've got a couple of questions I wanted to ask. So one is perhaps a difficult one, but I'll ask it anyway, which is, why wasn't the nation alerted about the virus back in December of 2019?
So we had the first reports of an unknown lower respiratory tract infection in China in early December, but the Chinese hadn't quite worked out whether these infections were related and whether there was a common agent that was causing this. It wasn't up until end of December that they worked out that this was a coronavirus infection, and at that stage the WHO was notified that they had an epidemic of coronavirus infection, and it looked like this was a new coronavirus infection.
Okay, thank you. I've got a question about vitamin D, and blood levels of vitamin D seem to be important. And what have we learned about that? What are we doing to ensure, in particular, that staff and patients who come from Black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds have appropriately high vitamin D levels?
So, that's absolutely correct, that vitamin D is very crucial in the function of the immune system, and we've seen this in a number of different infections, particularly with tuberculosis. There are a number of studies that are ongoing at the moment looking at the relationship between vitamin D levels and the risk of progressive COVID-19 and the effect of vitamin D supplementation. So let's wait for the data to come through.
Okay, great. And then a kind of compound question, which is, what do you see as the highest potential areas for future therapies? And can you talk about vaccines?
Sure. So let's take the second question first. So as people are aware, there are a huge number of vaccines that are going through clinical trials at the moment, and certainly at the Royal Free, we are starting to get involved with the vaccine trials. Realistically speaking, I think a tried and tested vaccine is probably not going to be available before the end of this winter. And so whilst we await that, I think getting effective treatments is going to be really important. And I think in that regard, antiviral therapy, in other words, switching of viral replication, is really going to be crucial. Whilst we have remdesivir, it's not the perfect antiviral agent, and so there's a couple of new antiviral agents that are coming through into clinical trials, and we're just setting those up at the moment. There's also antiviral monoclonal antibodies that are going to be very, very important, and one of the new ones is coming into the recovery trial very soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sanjay. I'm sure there will be more questions, and we'll come to those later on. So I'm pleased now to introduce our new group chief nurse, who was till very recently nursing director at Barnet Hospital, and is now our overall group chief nurse, and that's Julie Hamilton.
Thank you, Dominic, for that introduction. So my name is Julie Hamilton, and I am the new Group Chief Nurse at the Royal Free London, and I feel incredibly proud and privileged to be in that role now in my 6th week, and also very proud to be here this evening at my first annual members meeting. I'm going to talk over the next 10 minutes or so, really on trying to provide reassurance on how we are safely providing care for our patients throughout this COVID era. I think it's really important to say initially how incredibly proud I am, and others have echoed this evening, but of how our teams actually responded and managed during the first spike. It was really challenging, and I'm not going to hide the fact that it was really difficult for our staff, but actually what I saw was a group of people at every single level and in every single role who were really committed to ensuring safety for our patients, but also safety for each other and looking after each other in a kind and compassionate way. Although it has been really difficult and it was very challenging, staff really rose to the challenge, and the Royal Free London itself as an organisation across all its sites coped really well with what was occurring, even though we didn't know day to day what was going to happen next. We had staff who were committed, who were flexible. As alluded to earlier, we had members of staff who went completely outside their comfort zones to go and work in different areas such as intensive care, and also in other areas where they hadn't previously worked. And really it was to all work towards that common goal of making sure that our patients received safe and effective care in a safe place. We have undertaken a number of changes across all of our sites, and to help publicise this to our public, we actually prepared a couple of videos that are now on our website to access, and they really give some detail about how we are ensuring patient safety, both when you come into the hospital for an appointment, but also if you're planning to come in for a planned procedure, or through our urgent and emergency care platforms. In general, you will notice if you come to the hospital that there is increased vigilance at the front doors. So we do have security staff there who are handing out face coverings if the public enter the buildings without bringing their own face coverings. We've also introduced extra cleaning in all of our areas and in our clinical areas, including theatres, our intensive care wards, but also our wards, etc. What's really important to us as well is making sure we've got adequate social distancing. We've all heard about how important that is within the media, and it's particularly important within the hospital setting. And we have tried our hardest, and we have a really good system to make sure that we have that in place throughout our corridors from the front door, but also in each of our areas. And that's our clinical areas, but also if you come for an appointment, we've managed to make sure that we've got social distancing within those areas too, and within our waiting areas. If patients are attending for an appointment, as mentioned previously, we have had a number of video consultations and telephone calls during the months from March until now. That is continuing in some situations, but we will need to see some patients face to face. And when you come for an appointment, we will screen patients on arrival. So we ask a series of questions, and we also do a temperature check to make sure that that individual is okay to be in the environment, but also is okay to have their appointment. The social distancing element is really important in those waiting areas. And when patients come to the environment, there are markings within the chairs to make sure that patients don't sit together. And we are encouraging patients to come on their own, unless absolutely necessary, where someone might be necessary to come with them to escort them. It does look a bit different also in relation to staff. So staff are required to wear masks in all of our areas on entrance to the hospital, but also during consultations and also during giving clinical care. And that can be quite challenging in relation to communication, but we do have some additional masks now which enable staff to be able to talk through a visible area within the mask to help communications for particular patient groups. We have been really good as an organisation at aligning our protocols and procedures and actions with national guidelines and guidance. So that coming out from Public Health England, etc. And we have really stuck to that throughout the whole process. And we have updated our guidance internally as new elements have come out. The most recent of that is in relation to planned procedures. So if patients are coming for a planned procedure, we have really good processes in place to make sure that when you come to the hospital for that procedure, that you've undertaken the necessary preparation beforehand in relation to isolation, etc., but also having a swab, and then coming to the hospital. And we have separated out our ward areas to make sure that we're able to maintain segregation of low risk patients, those who might be at a higher risk, and those potentially who might come through with symptoms of COVID. The urgent and emergency care pathway, so we are seeing greater attendances through our A&Es on both of our sites, and that's actually quite important to us because we were concerned that we weren't seeing patients coming to our A&Es who actually needed to come. And we are open, we are here, and we are here to keep you safe when you come for your appointment. But if you need to come to A&E, we would really encourage you to do that if you need to have treatment. When you come through those emergency areas, again, the staff in those departments will effectively screen and they will ask questions in relation to any symptoms that you might have, but also the temperature checks. And we have really, really clear processes within those departments, even though it is an urgent and emergency department, of being able to separate patients out to make sure that we maintain safety, but also that we maintain social distancing. And then lastly, to be able to separate patients who may be at a high risk of having COVID from those who are at low risk and have no symptoms, or maybe who've had it in the past. To really keep our patients safe, it's so important to me and to all the members of the executive team and senior staff within the organisation that we really keep our staff safe. And that's both from a physical point of view, but also psychological. We have had adequate PPE throughout the pandemic, and we continue to have adequate PPE, and staff are wearing that effectively. And a number of us do go on regular walkabouts just to do some checks to make sure that's in place. And I'm very pleased to say that generally staff are adhering to PPE guidance, but also to social distancing. We are undertaking staff screening when staff come to work. And again, that takes the form of daily questioning or shift questioning regarding whether they feel okay. So it's a health and well-being check-in. Do they have any symptoms and do they have a temperature? We have introduced staff testing, so staff can access testing if they are symptomatic quickly and then be able to isolate themselves to protect themselves, their family, but also to protect our patients. It's been really important to us to make sure that we've risk assessed our staff. A number of our staff were off during the pandemic because of shielding requirements. Coming back is anxiety provoking for some of those staff. So we have undertaken risk assessments for all of our staff to make sure that they are safe to come back to work, and whether or not we need to put any mitigation in place or any additional support for them to enable them to return to their jobs. We're also encouraging remote working where possible and where it's feasible to do so, again to make sure that our staff feel safe and also that they feel protected. Caroline alluded to the flu campaign earlier, and this year I'm leading the flu campaign for the first time across the Royal Free London. It's important every year for all of us, both our population but also our staff, to get the flu vaccination, but it's even more important this year, and I am making a plea to everyone to make sure that you access that because having COVID and flu together is a concerning situation for all of us going into winter. I just want to finish by saying that my priority as the Chief Nurse of the Royal Free London It's really important to me to ensure that patients feel safe when they come to hospital, that they feel looked after, that they feel they're treated kindly, and that they feel that they're safe to be with us, but also that our staff feel safe to work in this environment. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julie. Can I ask a few questions now? So we've had a number of questions which relate to visiting and people being clear about what the rules are about visiting. So I wonder if you could talk to that. And there was a specific question about how we are helping in the case of severely ill patients, for example, cancer patients in late stage of their illness, and what provisions there are so that their loved ones can visit them, support them at this time.
Thank you, Dominic. This item actually has been really challenging for me as a nurse, for my colleagues as nurses and midwives. It's something that we're very used to having visitors around us and having that face-to-face communication. So it has been really difficult. It's been really difficult for our patients and for their loved ones and families. It is an unfortunate part of the pandemic that we have had to restrict visiting across all of our sites, and that also is the same across the hospitals within London, but also nationally. In relation to patients who are end of life, and also those who maybe have dementia and can become distressed or confused or delirious because of particular treatments that they're receiving, we have been having visiting allowance for those individuals because we recognise how important it is to have that communication and to have that presence for patients that are end of life. We're also making sure that we are doing, and we're in line with other organisations across London, and we are constantly reviewing whether or not we are able to bring visiting back, and we're currently doing that at the moment at this organisation, but also across others in NCL and in London as a whole.
Thanks very much. I've got a question about staff, raising awareness amongst staff. So I'd like to know how you're working to raise awareness amongst staff. I'm asking because recently had experience of an appointment at Chase Farm where the person we saw was wearing their mask over their mouth and chin, not the nose, and who tried to shake hands. So what are we doing to remind our staff all of the time about the various infection prevention and control guidance that we have in place?
Thank you, Dominic. Can I firstly say that I'm really sorry that experience happened. It is our aim that every single member of staff is fully aware of the expectations, and we do have really good communication channels in relation to when there is new guidance about PPE, etc., that goes out on our communication channels. But we can't just rely on our website, but also on emails, etc. So what's been really important is to have that senior clinical presence within the clinical environments, and that is one really effective way of making sure that, one, our staff are adhering to adequate and effective infection control measures and wearing of PPE, but also if we see practice that potentially isn't as it should be, that we can manage it at that particular time and deal with it at that time. So for me, it's a combination of making sure that we've got effective communication about what the requirements are, but also as senior leaders that we are out and about in the clinical areas and non-clinical areas to make sure we're reinforcing those messages.
Thank you. And then a third question is, for patients with long-term conditions who feel that they're at risk of COVID and don't want to come in to our hospitals, are there provisions for monitoring things like MRI, ECG, blood tests, and so at satellite sites, or not at the main hospitals, to prevent their condition deteriorating?
So thank you, Dominic, and others may want to join in who might have more information on this particular subject, but in relation to patients who do have long-term conditions, so we did do many more video consultations and telephone consultations during the COVID period, and we are continuing to offer those for patients who maybe are more anxious about coming in to the hospital sites despite all the measures that we have in place. And in those consultations, there would be a review of relevant documentation, recent blood results, etc. I don't know if anyone else, one of my colleagues, wants to add anything else.
Okay, I'm going to keep it to 3 at the moment, but it might be when we come back to the Q&A at the end, others might want to join in to make some comments on that very important question. There are other questions for you, Julie, but I'm going to spare you right now and move us on and come back to those questions later. I'm pleased to introduce our Chief Financial Officer, Peter Ridley, who's going to take us through what's happening with the money and to present the Finance and Performance Report. Over to you, Peter, and you are allowed slides, as I said before.
I am, thank you. So I guess I've got slides, and by its very nature, this will be one of the more backward-looking pieces as we're presenting the accounts here. So if I could start off on the next page. My name is Peter Ridley, I'm Chief Finance Officer, I should have said. Same slide as last year for those of you who are here, just to remind ourselves where the overall NHS is in terms of funding settlement. Need to say this has gone a little bit out of the window the last few months as resources have moved around systems in a different way in order to support in COVID, and in fact we've had a great deal of support nationally and regionally to make sure we've got the cash we need and the resources we need to deliver the services in this extraordinary time. But it's as much to remind ourselves that we're going into a period over the next 2 years where again the funding settlement will be quite challenging compared to keeping up with demand for services, so the financial pressure is still on. Next page, please. Sorry, can we click to the next slide? Thank you very much. So in presenting accounts, let me start with the auditor's opinion. So of course the Council of Governors appoint our auditors, and each year our auditors come in and review our annual accounts and our annual report. PricewaterhouseCoopers do that audit and have done for a number of years now. The headlines of that were the trust auditors were satisfied that our accounts gave a true and fair view, which is something they have to do on behalf of the Department of Health. There were no uncorrected misstatements. There were no material uncorrected misstatements and 1 or 2 minor aspects. So it was a relatively clean audit. And there was 1 or 2 things that I guess were unusual about this audit I should bring to your attention. Of course, our year-end audit was happening at peak COVID time as well, so where we'd usually have auditors on site working with us and particularly doing things like counting stock, that wasn't possible this year, so we had an audit that was completely virtual. And what that means is we do have something called a limitation of scope in our audit, which basically means the auditors couldn't verify themselves what our level of stock holding was. That was common to a number of organisations. There is also a piece of work that the auditors do around the value for money of our services. As with last year, there was a modified adverse opinion, as they call it. That basically means that we continue to require cash support from the system to deliver our services, and we'll talk a little bit more about our level of debt. But other than that, a clean audit. Next slide, if I could, please. So the basics, the headlines of this, we delivered a deficit of 32.5 million last year. So that was slightly ahead of the plan we had been set by NHS Improvement. So a good result. And that meant with the piece underneath it, we met our control total, and as a result, we got paid additional monies. So within that 32.5 million deficit, we received an additional 31 million pounds of income for hitting our financial targets, which was, needless to say, very welcome. We spent 73 million on capital, which I'll come on to just to give you a sense of what we spent that on, and we made significant savings again, as we need to each year in order to keep up with inflationary pressures and demand pressures. So if I move on to the next slide. So the headlines of our income and expenditure account. The 32 million pound deficit is shown there. Significant improvement on the 80 million pound deficit from the previous year. The 31 million I've just described of additional payments fitting our plan is a big part of that. But what we can see is we continue to make strides in reducing our deficit. So I think we're on now a trend of 4 years in a row where we've chipped away against the deficit. And so while the position is still financially challenging, it improves year on year despite the difficult financial settlements we've got. Just as a headline there, if you look at the income position, our income went up quite significantly from around patient care activities. So the 929 million you might be able to see there going up to 1015. It's quite interesting. Our growth in income continues to be around our emergency pathway. So we continue to see significant pressures on emergency pathways on our A&E services. So again, that continues to be the area of growth, and year on year, that's where we continue to see significant increase in activity through the door. There is also in this position quite a lot of additional income around COVID, and we'll talk a little bit more about how that flowed. So if I can move on to the next slide. Just to give you a sense of where the income comes from and what we spend our money on, our income continues to primarily come from the commissioners of our services, as you'd expect, with 36% coming from specialist commissioning. And what that means is they are services that are generally commissioned in very few providers. So they are some of our really specialist programs like our transplant activity and also aspects of renal and cancer. So we continue to do a lot of specialist services, with 50% you'll see there coming from our local commissioners to deliver local care to local patients. On the right hand side, our expenditure follows a similar pattern to previous years. As with most organisations in the NHS, our staff costs are the majority of our cost base, and what's unusual here is the level of our drugs bill, and we still think we are potentially the highest drugs costs in the country just due to the nature of our services. So just short of £200 million a year is spent on drugs in this organisation, and that continues the trend from previous years. If we move on to the next slide, just to give you a sense of what's changed year on year, as we described, continue to make significant efficiencies. So £40 million are delivered in year in efficiencies across a whole range of schemes around use of our scarce resources in more effective ways, whether that's increasing the amount of patients we can see for our operating theatres or outpatient settings, in getting better deals from suppliers on our non-pay costs, and making sure that we use our workforce as efficiently as possible. During the year, we continued the trend of reducing our agency spend. So our substantive staff costs went up by 8 million, but agency went down, which of course has benefits through not paying agency premiums. But of course, our substantial workforce is trained in our processes, understands how things work here, and of course really comes into its own when the pressure's on. Our research and development income increased year on year. So we continue to grow in terms of the research we do in this organisation, which is positive from a research point of view, but also lots of added benefits to our services. In the bottom left hand corner, some of the COVID costs started to come in at the very tail end of the year we're describing here, to the end of March. So there was a significant spend in our position around COVID because we played quite a key role in supporting the wider London response to COVID. So we have quite significant spend that went through our books to support things like the Nightingale Centre down at the Excel Centre. So as with others, helped the London-wide initiative in order to make sure we could respond to the COVID pandemic. Pension costs increased as they continue to do. That was fully funded by Department of Health, but it's another reason our cost base went up, and indeed pay and non-pay inflation continues to rise. If I could go to the next slide. This is our statement of financial position, or balance sheet, as we continue to call it internally. I guess the things we'll see here is we'll talk about capital, but at the very top of that balance sheet are our non-current assets, so our property, plant, equipment, so our buildings and our equipment continue to grow in value as we invest in those assets to deliver the services we need to do. And you will see, however, on this balance sheet that borrowings appears a couple of times here. We continue to have significant borrowings. Those borrowings are all from the Department of Health and the Treasury, so they're not external borrowings, they're all within the public sector, but due to the difficult financial settlement and our ongoing deficits, we've continued to have to borrow in order to pay our bills. There'll be a new process this year where there's a recognition that that's borrowing within the system, and there will be a change in the way that borrowing is described to recognise that actually NHS organisations with significant borrowing, the way that's paid back is not the same as in a commercial setting. And if I can move to the next slide, which talks about our investments. So our capital programme, where we invested our money, there was a total of 73 million. So it's a very significant capital programme continues. And we were very successful in pulling in additional sources of investment. So within that 73 million pounds, 11 million of that was bid for against various central pots of money in year, which was very welcome and really helps us source additional investment. A significant chunk continued to be spent on finishing off Chase Farm Hospital, and that's the 11.9 million. There's lots of other building works going on at all of our sites, so significant works continue at the Royal Free Hospital in terms of backlog maintenance, in terms of lifts, in terms of just of keeping the estate going, and we saw the first instalments of the new ward building that some of you may have seen at Barnet Hospital, so the new modular ward building that increases capacity at Barnet. And we continue to spend a lot on IM&T, so IT and digital services, that being the future of how we'll deliver healthcare. That ongoing investment is really important to make sure we have systems to support our staff, and a large chunk of that this year was on the infrastructure that goes around it. So Wi-Fi systems, making sure we have the service we need, and making sure, frankly, the IT is there when people need it and need to use it. And finally, medical equipment continues to be really important in that capital programme. In particular, quite a lot of imaging equipment in the year we're talking about. So new MRI scanners, new mammography equipment for the breast service, and various other imaging equipment. Move on, just two final slides, just a couple on performance as well as finance. Our A&E performance remained underneath the 95% constitutional target. That's the patients seen within 4 hours in A&E. Across the country, providers continued to struggle to hit that measure, and of course the year-end position on this is affected by what we were going through in March, but continues to be a struggle to hit the targets in A&E, to hit those 4-hour waits, and it's something we continue to focus on, and investments continue to go into areas in terms of both workforce and facilities to help us achieve that. And the next and final slide is our cancer performance. So again, under where we need to be on our cancer performance, and continues to be a significant focus for us as an organisation. The cancer performance and how we recover cancer services as we've come out of the COVID period has been something we've spent an awful lot of time concentrating on, and we're utilising capacity both within the NHS and outside the NHS to make sure we can deliver the services we need to our cancer patients. And that's broadly a review of the year.
Thanks very much, Peter, and you'll be delighted to know that no one has asked any questions about the dark arts of NHS finance, so you are off the hook. But I do need, as part of our formal business, to note that we've received the accounts and we've accepted the accounts for the year. And now we're going to move in the last period of time to answer the questions that have been raised that we haven't got to so far. And I'm going to go first to Julie, if I might. Julie, I wanted to ask a question about staff testing. So over to Julie, which is, the question was, you said staff can get tested if they have symptoms, but what about those who don't show symptoms? Because we know that there's a lot of asymptomatic transmission.
Thank you, Dominic, and thank you for the question. So at the moment, we are testing at this trust those staff who are showing symptoms. But for staff who are attending work on a day-to-day and shift basis, we're not doing formal swabbing of those staff if they don't have symptoms. But what we are doing is doing a health and wellbeing check of each member of staff to ask if they've got any symptoms. Are they feeling okay? And at the moment, that's what we're aiming for. There is a study that is being introduced looking at asymptomatic testing, which we will also be part of, but we won't be swabbing routinely at the moment.
Thank you. And then I had a question, is there an ambulance service that could bring regular patients to the clinics as people fear taking taxis these days?
So Peter's nodding at me, saying that he will answer this question.
Okay, over to you, Peter.
Do you want me to take that one? I'm not sure how the screen comes to me, but there we go. So yes, the position on non-emergency patient transport is that currently nationally NHS England and NHS Improvement has suspended eligibility criteria for non-emergency patient transport. So as it stands at the moment, patient transport is temporarily available on request, so patients can request that transport, and the number to contact for that service is on our website, and we just ask for 2 days notice. So for patients who are required to avoid public transport and are not able to make their own way by driving, being driven, by using private taxis, so it's particularly patients who've been shielding prior to surgery, or who are clinically vulnerable, there is a service available there, and there's a number that they can contact.
Thank you very much, and sorry to pass it your way, Julie, when it should have been you, Peter. I've now got a number of questions which I'm going to put Caroline on the stand for, if possible, and some of them around patients, some of them around our staff, some of them around our estates and the environment around some of our hospitals. So if you don't mind, I'm going to put you on the spot, and feel free to invite other colleagues to help if there are questions that you want to do. I wanted to come back to the question that was asked earlier that Julie said others might have views on, which is about patients with long-term conditions and whether we could find ways of, or the system could find ways of monitoring like blood tests at satellite sites, or ways that don't require people to come in to hospital sites where there may be patients with COVID being treated.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I can do this. So I suppose the first thing is I'd reflect on what Julie was saying, and actually that our hospitals are safe environments, and we're working really, really hard to make sure that where it's appropriate for people to come into hospitals, they will be safe. And I hope that people heard what Julie said. However, we have for years and years realised that often we ask people to come into hospitals when it's not appropriate, it's inconvenience. You know, I speak as someone with a long-term condition that has to go and give blood every month, and it's really inconvenient, isn't it? So people might have heard of these integrated care partnerships, which are being formed across the country. Actually, in North London we have 5, and they're the partnerships that work around the local authorities, and it's where we talk about exactly this sort of thing. So how do we best provide care in the right possible place? How do we avoid patients having to come into hospital for tests? Post-COVID, we are talking about forming more community diagnostic hubs in exactly the way that this question's asked. So I think you should expect to see more on that. Some of it is dependent on money, and as Peter's just reminded us, money's still tight. But we're working across North London to try and get more diagnostic hubs, to try and get the technology in place so that patients can do more remote care monitoring from their homes. That's really important. Those technologies do exist now. And again, there's a big national programme on rolling out remote monitoring for things like urinary tract infection and some other types of monitoring. So I think you can expect to see more. Right now, there isn't enough. We've worked quite hard across North London to make sure that things like phlebotomy services are more in the community than in the hospital. You should expect to see more of that, and I think it will happen largely through these integrated care partnerships.
Thank you very much. I wanted to ask about mental health, which is, you know, what about mental health? Is the Royal Free prepared or preparing for an increase in demand for mental health services? Yeah,
so we work very hard with our mental health provider colleagues across North London, so Barnet, Enfield, Haringey, Tavistock and Portman, and Camden and Islington Mental Health Trusts, and they're all part of the integrated care system. It's true to say that the hospital is sometimes the place of safety for people, and we don't always get it right, and it's often confusing. And so we're working hard on actually making sure that when we see a rise in COVID admissions for patients who present with mainly mental health issues, they're seen in the right place. So we are preparing. We take it very seriously. We recognise there's an issue. We don't always get it right. And again, you should watch out for more from both us and the integrated care system.
Thank you. Question about coordination with local surgeries in test and trace. And are we working in different ways between the trust and local surgeries? Are there ways we could work more closely together, for example, in testing and tracking cases?
There are always ways we can work more closely together, I'm sure, and I'm not sure exactly what's behind this question, because I could speak for hours about tracking and tracing and testing and what's going on at the moment. We are working with primary care. It's different in the different boroughs. Remember, we cover Barnet, Enfield, Haringey, Hertfordshire, as well as patients from other boroughs. But we're working with predominantly GPs from those boroughs to make sure that these services are more integrated and more effectively given.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. There was a question about booking admin, and I know that we've had lots of issues over time about the confusing nature of booking admin and booking online for phone assessments. And what are we doing to get better at that? I'm not going to go into the detail of the specific question, but what are we doing to get better at providing a very simple and easy way of doing bookings?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm really sorry. I receive more complaints and anxiety about our booking processes, hardly any about the care we provide. So first of all, I'm sorry. I know that many of our processes are cumbersome. And in fact, what you won't know is that we've spent the last year reorganizing a lot of our processes, and it'll take us a bit longer to try and make them more simple. You heard me talk earlier about our patient portal, My RFL Care. That's part of it, because for those patients that want to, they can access their care by going onto the Royal Free website, and you'll see how you can register through that. And that will start to give you more control over your appointments and interact with our clinicians and our administrators in a much more effective, patient-centered way. But we don't always get it right. I know that, and we've got much more work to do. And I think it will get better quite quickly. But we're always keen to hear feedback. So I'm sorry to the questioner, because I imagine they've had a confusing administrative experience. We are spending a lot of time thinking about it, and you will see some benefit of that soon.
Thank you. A related question, which is, how do we register for the online portal that you were talking about?
Yeah, well, the best thing to do is go on the Royal Free website, and it's right there in front of you. If we write up this later, we'll put some more instructions, but basically go on the website and you can register through that.
Okay, great. I've got a question about the Streams app that I was mentioning earlier, and is it available to everyone in all departments? It sounds like it would be really beneficial for many disciplines.
It's rolled out across the Royal Free and across Barnet. It's not rolled out to every single department, but it is rolled out to several hundred staff, and I wish I could remember the number because someone told me recently. And we roll it out to those staff where we think they will benefit most. Again, we can provide a note after this of exactly who we've rolled out to and where it's going next.
Great, thank you. Moving on to staff, I've got a question for staff, which is, can you give some specific examples of initiatives that you're going to take going forward to improve staff health and well-being as in the next phase? What are the ones that you think are going to be most important?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I think, and Julie actually is going to chair our wellbeing programme, so she might want to chip in. But the way that I would describe this is we think about psychological wellbeing for our staff, and we think about physiological wellbeing, specifically around cardiovascular health. And in the past, on physiological wellbeing, actually we've run programs particularly for our lower paid members of staff on healthy eating, exercise, mindfulness type programs, and we've built on that now, and the plan is to do much more of that. And on psychological therapies, I've alluded to this before, but a range of therapies. Remember, the Royal Free group is blessed with a lot of people who are psychologists, psychiatrists, psychotherapists who provide support to our patients through regular business, and they've been really helpful in helping us construct a therapeutic program for our staff, both as individuals and as teams when they've needed it. So much more to follow. I don't know how you're going to do this, Dominic, given the technology, but lots more where that came from.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to move into a last category for you, and then Peter, you'll be delighted to know there have been questions about finances, so I'll be coming back to you in a minute. But a very similar question to the question about the Pears building, which is the plans for Maggie's Cancer Centre in Hampstead. Are they put on hold due to COVID?
So in a sense, because planning permissions and things like that just have gone a bit slower, but we still plan to have a Maggie's site on the Royal Free, on the Maggie's Centre on the Royal Free site in the next couple of years, and we're really excited about it. We think it's a fantastic offer for our patients and their carers, and it will really help us. You know, we're one of the biggest cancer centres in the UK, and I think it's really important that we have a centre like Maggie's to work with us. So it will happen.
Great. When will the patient garden be restored?
Well, it depends which garden you mean, because of course we have gardens in a number of different places. But if it's the garden in the Royal Free that used to be on top of the car park, we're working on plans to restore that in due course, and with the memorials that were there as well, which are currently in storage. If it's a garden up at Chase Farm, I think the answer is we have an enormous vista at Chase Farm now with much better planting, and that's kind of the replacement. And if it's another garden, I don't know about it.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I wanted to ask about parking. Camden proposes to remove all parking on Haverstock Hill. Surely this will affect the Royal Free massively.
It might. I don't know. What I will say is that we're currently thinking about parking and being quite thoughtful about how we make sure that our staff can park and also that our patients can park. The situation is quite volatile at the moment because, of course, we've got people working from home who weren't normally. We've got patients who aren't coming in who would normally, and it's quite difficult to know how that's all going to settle down. Throw in the removal of a CPZ, and that's another thing for us to consider. But yeah, good spot, and I'm sure it will affect us.
Okay, great. That we do have a few more, but I don't think we're going to have time to be able to get through any more of the estate's questions. But I promised you, Peter, that we had some finance questions, so maybe we could pass over to Peter. And we have a question which is, I understood that at the start of the current crisis, the government wrote off the debts of foundation trusts. Is this so? And if so, why do you still have such a large debt?
Very good question. Yes, so that's exactly what happened. There was a decision made that debts of foundation trusts, those debts they hold with the Treasury for ongoing support of costs in hospitals, would be written off. The reason our accounts still show such a large debt is they didn't have time to enact it by year end. So that has now gone through this year. In effect, what that means is if you were looking at the accounts of a commercial body, they've effectively converted debt to equity. So what that means is we have had the debts written off, and that basically now sits as equity, so a government investment in the hospital. So that's been enacted this financial year. So when I present this time next year, that's when you'll see it's been transferred over. It just didn't happen by the end of March.
Okay, thank you. And I wanted to ask a question which is possible you don't know the answer to, but it's a very important one, which is how much money did you receive from Captain Sir Tom Moore's remarkable efforts, and what was it spent on?
So let me give you a little bit of the answer. So I don't know how much we got precisely from Sir Tom Moore's efforts, but we did receive a share of the kind of NHS charities together and all the amazing things people did to raise money for the NHS during that period. So I don't know the exact number, and I'd have to check in with charity colleagues. And what we spent our money on from the charity, there was a vast range of things. So the amount of things that have been supported by charitable funding has been quite extraordinary, and Caroline described some of them at the start, but it was anything from research efforts to accommodation for our staff, to meals for our staff, to investments in the psychological support for our staff. There are studies to really take the lessons of how we've dealt with this period, so we'll be better prepared next time, and significant investments in what we call rest areas for our staff. So places our staff can go to rest, to change, to just spend a little bit of time away from the front line. So a very large number of things that were supported by the charity in which we couldn't have done otherwise, and that ran to many thousands of pounds.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much, and thank you to all of our speakers. It's over to me now to wrap up and to close the meeting. We haven't managed to answer all of your questions, and I have managed to dodge any of them, but I am going to take two briefly, and we will commit to answer any of the all of the other ones that we didn't get to and post the answers online. So I'm going to take two about how the public can engage with us. One was, I'm a patient, what can I do to help? And I would say simply volunteer. Contact the Royal Free Charity and work with them on volunteering. We absolutely depend upon our volunteers, and there are many things that they do. So I would send you that way. And then the second question is, how can we involve the membership more in the decision-making process for future plans, which is a very important question. We have a number of mechanisms for that. You can become a governor, you can vote for governors, you can come to our Medicine for Members events. We have increasingly we involve patients in service redesign work across pathways across our hospitals, so you can ask to be involved in that. But it does strike me in the question that we probably need to do a better job, perhaps via the website, of being clear about the routes that you can take in to shape decision making, because it's so important. I'm going to finish. We are now at 7:30 out of time. I'd like to thank you for your time. Thank you for those who left suggestions and comments and not questions in the chat. Some very helpful contributions there. I really appreciate that. And thank you so much for those of you who left so many lovely comments about our staff. That was very kind. With that, I'm glad to finish on time. Hopefully we have answered as many questions as we could in the time, and that this format has worked for us. We would be interested in your feedback, things that work well, things that we could do better for next time. You will see a slide coming up in a moment which has the email address of our governors. That's a good place to give feedback and also to contact the governors. But with that, thank you so much for joining us, and good evening.